The snow is pressing against her chest and she cannot breathe. Not because the air is gone, not yet, but because the weight of 3 meters of compacted snow rests on her ribcage like concrete that is hardening, like the earth itself has decided to keep her. She cannot feel her legs. She cannot feel her arms except one, the right one, frozen in position with the broken half of the ski pole in her fist, the only connection between her and anything she can control. The darkness is absolute, not the dark of a closed room or a cloudless night, the dark of a material, the dark of inside, and the only sound is her own breathing, echoing centimeters from her face, bouncing back from the snow wall so close she could put her tongue on it. And that, as she is going to learn, is going to matter. This is the human limit. I am your host. If you want to understand how far human resilience really goes, if you believe that the mind is the most powerful survival tool evolution has ever produced, subscribe to this channel right now and hit the like button. Because what I am about to tell you is the story of 8 days in an ice coffin. 8 days in total darkness. 8 days in the silence under 3 meters of snow, rationing air, melting ice centimeter by centimeter, controlling the mind in a way that exceeds the limit of what human beings can do, and enters the territory of what a human being can accomplish through pure refusal to die. She was not a beginner. That is the first thing you need to understand. She had taught skiing on mountains that most people could not identify on a map. She knew avalanche terrain. She knew snow slabs, knew the signs, knew the sound that compacted snow makes when it begins to separate from the layer beneath it. She had pulled other people out of avalanches. She had done the trainings and read the statistics and carried the equipment and made every right decision for every right reason. And then she made a wrong decision, on a mountain, on a day when the snowpack decided it had had enough. She describes the morning of the accident day with the specific clarity that survivors develop for the hours before a life-changing event, a quality of attention that comes from knowing the normal world was about to close. The sky was clear, visibility was perfect. The temperature was cold in the specific way that produces compact snow, not the wet snow of warm days, but crystalline, hard, binding snow that under pressure becomes something indistinguishable from concrete. She was alone on the slope, as she sometimes was, far from marked runs in the terrain she loved because it was untouched, because there were no other tracks in it except the ones she made. She heard it before she felt it. That is what people experience with avalanches describe, and that is difficult to convey because it describes the sound of something that has not yet happened, but has already been decided. A rumble. Not from below like an earthquake, but from above and all around, as if the landscape had made a resolution. And then the sound of breaking glass, the specific sound of a snow slab tearing from its bond with the layer beneath it, a sound crisp and final, like no other natural sound she had ever heard. She tried to ski. She tried to traverse the slope diagonally, which is what training says and which is correct as a response when you have time. She did not have time. The slab was already in motion and she was in it, and what is important about an avalanche is not the speed, although the speed is terrifying. What is important is the end. What is important is what happens when the snow stops and transforms in seconds from a liquid into a solid. Because in those seconds, the position you are in is the position you will be in for an indeterminate period. She rolled. She was rolled. The difference is significant. The difference between what is done actively and what happens. And what happened is that she became an object inside a material that does not negotiate, that gives no feedback, that compresses and turns and positions the body according to laws of physics that do not care about the preferences of the person it contains. She tried to create an air pocket in front of her face, pressing her hand against her mouth, which is what training says. She does not know if it succeeded. She does not know if the pocket she has is the result of her action or the result of chance. What she knows is that when the snow stopped, she was still breathing, and breathing was the only report on reality that mattered at that moment. And then there was silence. The kind of silence that reigns under 3 meters of snow is not the absence of sound. It is the total absorption of sound. Snow swallows vibrations in a way that is uncanny, that the brain registers as wrong, as a quality of silence for which there is no experiential basis because human beings do not live in materials that absorb sound this completely. She could hear her teeth chattering. She could hear her own blood pulsing in her ears. She could not hear the slightest sound from the world outside. No wind, no birds, no voices that might somewhere above be calling her name or might not. Only the internal sounds of a body that is still alive and that is packed inside something that does not want it to be. She tried to move. Her legs did not respond. That was either the compression of the snow or shock or both, and she could not determine which in that moment, and the determination was not what mattered. What mattered was the right hand that could move, that held the ski pole, that represented the only mobile part of her not completely bound by the snow. She felt the broken half of the pole, the sharp end where it had broken, and she understood immediately what that meant. A tool. A bad tool, an inadequate tool, but a tool. And in an ice coffin 3 meters under an avalanche, a bad tool is the whole world. The first thing she did was not dig. The first thing she did was stop. She describes this decision as the most important decision she has ever made in her life. More important than any technical decision on the mountain. More important than any navigation or equipment problem she had ever solved. The decision to stop, to control the breathing, to lower the heart rate. Not because she was not afraid. She was afraid in a way that makes the word afraid trivial. A fear that was like a physical thing standing next to her in the small space, consuming the same air budget she was consuming. But because she knew the math. Here is the math. An adult human produces carbon dioxide with every exhalation. In a closed space, carbon dioxide accumulates. When carbon dioxide reaches a high enough level, the brain stops functioning, and then the rest stops functioning. The rate at which carbon dioxide accumulates is a direct function of breathing rate. A calm person in a small space has more time than one in panic. A person in panic hyperventilates. Hyperventilation accelerates carbon dioxide production. This is not theory. This is not motivation. This is chemistry. And the chemistry would kill her faster than cold, and faster than hunger, and faster than thirst, if she did not maintain control of the only thing she could control. She controlled her breathing. The words sound simple. It was not simple. Every instinct in her was screaming to breathe fast, to breathe deep, to pull oxygen into the churned lungs. The amygdala, the ancient part of the brain that manages threat, was producing every signal pushing her toward hyperventilation. Working against those signals did not require courage in the conventional sense. It required something colder. It required the ability to intervene in the nervous system, to place the mind between the instinct and the action, to treat every single breath as a decision rather than a reaction. 4 seconds in, hold. 6 seconds out. 4 seconds in, hold. 6 seconds out. She counted, not as distraction, though it was also that, as structure, as proof to herself that she was still calculating, still functioning, still the person making decisions and not the person things were happening to. Test for direction. That is the second thing she did, once the breathing was stable. In the dark under the snow there is no orientation. There is no sense of up and down that is reliable. No visual signal, no sun, no horizon. There is the sensation of gravity, but gravity tells you which way is down, and what you need is which way is up, and up is opposite to gravity. But in a space smaller than a coffin, you do not know which direction you are facing. She spat. She waited. She could not tell where the saliva fell. She tried to feel the tears she could not prevent, which way it ran. Downward. That was downward. So the opposite direction was upward. So that was the direction to dig. She began. With the broken end of the ski pole, with the one arm that could move even in limited range, in a space that allowed no comfortable movement, she began to dig. Not dig in the sense of energetic material removal. Dig in the sense of scraping millimeters, pressing the hard, sharp end of the broken pole against the ice wall that formed the edge of her air pocket. Scraping a small piece, blowing the scraped material away, pressing again. Millimeters. Maybe. In an hour. The ice was not snow. That is something people who have not experienced avalanches do not understand. The snow that buried her had passed from a suspension to a material upon stopping, had become avalanche cement, had become something that has the same consistency as freeze-dried concrete. This snow does not respond to pressing. It has to be chiseled. The sharp end of the pole was her chisel. Her body heat was her only heating element, and progress measured itself in units too small for normal measurement. The cold began to become serious by the end of the first day. She had not lost body temperature upon arrival because the avalanche itself generates heat through friction. But once still, the cold became an independent problem. The temperature inside the snow is stable, a few degrees below zero, which is cold but not immediately fatal if the body is producing heat. The body produces heat through movement and metabolism. She could barely move. Her metabolism was slowing as calories ceased to exist. The heat exchange was negative and becoming more negative with every hour. She discovered melting by accident. Or perhaps not by accident. Perhaps training had given her something she was not consciously recalling. She pressed her lips against the ice wall while testing orientation in the small space, and she felt that the warmth of her lips was changing the ice on a microscopic scale, that the body heat radiating through her lips and tongue was actually producing a reaction on the ice surface. Melting, drop by drop, gram per hour. But water. In a situation where dehydration was one of the causes of death on the table, water was not metaphorical. Water was the difference between today and tomorrow. She licked ice. That sounds primitive, and it was also the smartest thing she could do in that situation. She pressed her tongue against the ice wall and waited for the drop and collected it. That was not enough water for hydration in any conventional sense. It was enough to push the absolute end of dehydration off by hours, and in a situation where hours represent progress measured in millimeters, pushing off by hours was everything. The second day was the hardest until the fifth. She describes the second day as the day the reality of the situation arrived completely. On the first day there is adrenaline. There is the acuity of fresh danger, the sharpness of the mind responding to an immediate threat. On the second day, the adrenaline is gone, and what remains is the raw fact. Here I am. Here I will continue to be. The sun I cannot see has risen and set, and risen and will set again, and the space around me is the same space, and the ice is the ice, and the pole is the pole, and the millimeters are the millimeters. She began counting the hours. That gives her structure, and structure gives the mind something to hold on to when sliding into panic or sliding into dissociation are the other options. She counted breaths, how many per minute, calculated the hours. She set herself miniature goals. This millimeter before I have breathed 10 times. This amount of ice to lick before I stop. This wrist movement 100 times, 100 times, 100 times. The hallucinations began on the third day. They were auditory first. Voices, not her own. Voices that seemed to come from outside, through the snow, muffled and indistinct, but recognizable as voices. She knew what they were. Sleep deprivation and hypoxia and the stress of an extreme survival situation produce auditory hallucinations that are well documented. She knew that and heard them anyway, and the main danger of the hallucinations was not the terror of having them. Treating them appropriately was the danger. Distinguishing between what was real and what was being produced. Responding as if the voices were real meant shouting, meant hyperventilating, meant consuming the carbon dioxide budget she did not have. She did not answer them. That was the specific discipline survival required. Not being afraid. Not having the hallucinations. Not silencing the ancient parts of the brain that want to shout when they hear voices. But holding the response back, keeping the body still, keeping the breathing controlled. 4 seconds in, hold 6 seconds out, while the mind produced things that made that difficult. On the fourth day, the ice changed. She had been working, millimeter by millimeter, on the wall she held to be upward, and at some point on the fourth day, the ice began to have a different texture. Lighter, less dense. What that could mean was that she was approaching the edge of the avalanche deposit. the place where the density of the accumulation dropped because the energy of the fall had dissipated. What that meant for her position was either that she was closer to the surface than she thought, or that she had moved horizontally toward the margin of the material. Both were better than the alternative. She dug faster. That is a relative statement. Faster than millimeters per hour can still be very slow, but the change in texture gave her something the previous 4 days had not given, a feedback that looked like progress. Not hope in the emotional sense. She was too far beyond emotions in the conventional sense to speak of hope. But data. The data said the material was becoming different. Different was not the same as worse, so different was better than the same. The 5th and 6th days blur in her account. That is what hypothermia and sleep deprivation and caloric deficit and hypoxia combined with weeks, hours of constant physical restriction due to time. She describes periods as very long and then as very short. She describes moments of clear precision, the counting working, the millimeters measured, the breaths controlled, alternating with stretches where she cannot say exactly what she was thinking, or whether she was thinking, or what the time between one clear moment and the next contained. What she says is that the work did not stop. That is the extraordinary thing. Not the clarity, not the strength, not the resolve to be awake and coherent at every moment. The extraordinary thing is that when the conscious will dissolved and the body took over the work, and the body was functioning at the limits that define normal physical function, the work did not stop. The pole was still moving. The ice was still being scraped. The tongue was still licking the melted drops. As if what she was, the person she was engraved deeper in her than consciousness, deeper than cognition, in a place that continues when everything else has stopped. On the 7th day she heard a different sound, not a hallucination. She had learned to distinguish to the degree that the brain in the state she was in was reliable. The sound of a hallucination came from inside the sound itself, had a quality that was internally generated. The sound on the 7th day came from above, muffled through the snow but with the quality of outside, an external source of vibration transmitting itself through the material around her. She struck the ice wall. With everything she had, with the ski pole and her fist and her elbow, she struck in rhythmic patterns as training said. 3 short strikes. Pause. 3 short strikes. 3 is the emergency signal. 3 is what you do when you are buried, and you can. The sound above her changed. She cannot say whether it got louder or closer, or whether the change occurred in her perception and not in the sound itself. What she can say is that the quality of it changed, that the vibrations in the snow around her took on a different frequency, one that was organic in a way that inorganic compression waves are not. That was the frequency of something that moves. Dogs have a nasal precision that exceeds human understanding. They can detect body odor through several meters of compacted snow. The rescue dogs working that day on the Avalanche slope had no knowledge of 8 days in an ice coffin. They had no knowledge of controlled breaths and millimeter progress and ice melting and hallucinations held back. They had a scent. The scent led them to a point on the snow, and they dug. The light came first, not the direct sunlight. The light of the less dense layer as the rescuer's shovel broke through the snow above her and daylight penetrated the material that had held her for 8 days. She describes it as a quality of brightness for which she had no calibrated response, because 8 days of total darkness recalibrates the retina, sets it to darkness, and this brightness registered not as normally pleasant, but as everything at once. She called out. Finally, after 8 days of not calling out, of holding back breath, of controlling her voice, she called out, and the call that came out of her was not what she expected to hear. Not a strong voice, not an exhausted voice, but something between the two, something that is difficult to name because it contained all 8 days at once, the compressed and the dark and the millimeter by millimeter and the breath control and the counting and the hallucinations held back and the ice licked and the striking in signal patterns and the determination of the direction of up and the getting up in the deepest sense of the word. The decision made on the first day in the dark not to die, and the execution of that decision over 8 days. The shovel through the snow, the hands of the rescuer, the face of a human being looking at her, from above, from a direction that was actually above. She was dug out. That process took hours because the compacted material around her had to be removed carefully to minimize damage. And while she was being dug out, she lay still, maintaining the breathing control, 4 seconds in, hold, 6 seconds out, because the habit of 8 days was stronger than the certainty of rescue, and because the body retains what it has learned, even when the reason for learning is over. When she was completely freed from the snow and she saw the sun, not daylight, not brightness, but the actual sun, the actual sky, the actual blue she had not seen for 8 days, she says she did not cry. She says the first thing she did was inhale, deep, completely, without counting, without rationing, pulling air into her lungs because the air was there and she could take it and no one and nothing was telling her to control it. One breath that counted after 8 days. She was in the hospital several weeks. She had frostbite on her fingers and toes, and the hypothermia required careful treatment. Her lungs that had adapted to the tight breathing budget needed time to return to normal capacity. The muscles that had worked piece by piece for 8 days in a coffin needed time. The mind that had held back the hallucinations and counted the millimeters and controlled the breaths for 8 days needed time in a different way. She describes the recovery with the same pragmatism that carried her through the 8 days. What is interesting in that is not the recovery. What is interesting is what she says about the 8 days when she is asked, the specific way she describes what happened. She says, "I did nothing heroic. I did not defeat physics. I did not defeat biology. I did not make possible what was physically impossible. What I did was continue what was possible exactly to the limit of the possible, without going beyond it. The possible was taking one breath after another. That was the possible. That was everything. That is the human limit." Subscribe to this channel. Leave a comment. Tell me whether you believe you could have controlled your breathing in that first moment in the dark, held back the scream, held back the panic, counted the 4 seconds in and 6 seconds out while the mind produces every instinctive signal pointing in the opposite direction. I read every single comment. I will be back with another story from the place where human beings find out what they are when the only thing left is the will to continue. The snow is still there. The mountain is still there. The ice that held her 8 days has changed, has melted and refrozen, and been covered by other snow. The natural cycle of a mountain that does not remember specific events. What remains is in her, the calibration of the breaths, the understanding that panic is a luxury that has to be paid for. The knowledge that the mind, correctly used, does not work against survival, but is the mechanism through which survival becomes possible. Somewhere in the mountains there is a place she did not mark after her rescue, and did not want to mark. A point in the snow above which the sun rises and sets without regard for what occurred beneath it for 8 days. And she lives, and breathes, and has never completely forgotten the control of every breath.